Welcome to the Sussex Election 43 show. My name is Brett James, and I'm joined today by Tom Blackwell of the National Post. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
Tom is a longtime journalist, former member of the Queen's Park Press Gallery when we first met, in fact, and today focuses on global affairs and Canada's role in the world and how that may affect domestic politics, which is what we want to talk about today.
Sounds good.
Off the top, I mean, I think we break this down a little bit by region or country in terms of Canada's relationship and what it might mean coming back to domestic politics. So let's start with China, sort of the big elephant in all of these things. I'm interested in your thoughts. I think that Chinese immigration patterns have changed over the years, and I think you've followed that more closely than I may have, and how that affects some of the current issues and how they're playing out and how Canada's handled them. And I'll get into some of the nuance of that too with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a controversial area, and it's not always sort of, entirely visible what's happening. But essentially, I mean, previous waves of ethnic Chinese immigration to Canada tended to come from places like Hong Kong and Taiwan, not from mainland China. The trend over the last 20 years or so is for that immigration to come from mainland China, people who are probably more educated and who grew up under the communist regime. And so that is a sort of a growing block within the Chinese Canadian community. And those people, I think arguably, tend to be somewhat more loyal to, or at least tend to sort of side a bit more on some of these issues with the government of China than other Chinese Canadians. And certainly that is something that the Chinese government, through its sort of covert influence campaigns, is trying to encourage, at least. Whether those mainland Chinese immigrants, really deeply feel these things, the Chinese government is certainly trying to encourage that in various ways.
I find that an interesting point because I think of other communist countries in the past where immigrants to Canada viewed it more that they escaped, they got out. So I'm sure they maintained a love for their homeland, but not necessarily, certainly almost exclusively not for the government that they had escaped from. So that's differently viewed by more recent Chinese immigrants, for instance, who, again, came here under communist rule, but they're not necessarily disaffected by that communist rule. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so to a certain extent. I mean, it's really difficult to tell, sort of, in a general sense, where their allegiances lie. It'd be interesting to do some polling, where people can sort of respond anonymously on that issue. But I think part of it, and to be fair, is there's also sort of a fear amongst people who are recent immigrants from China in terms of speaking out against the Chinese government, because in many cases they have relatives back in China, and it's well documented that sometimes Chinese will take retribution against relatives, for what people do outside of China, and also many of them have businesses in China, which again can be affected in a sort of similar way. So people are, and I found this in reporting in this area, people are very nervous about speaking about the Chinese government, about these issues. So I mean that's definitely part of the dynamic.
I had to explain to my kids because we were driving downtown a couple of weeks ago. There were rallies in support of the Hong Kong protesters, but those that I think they were Chinese that were part of that rally had their own faces covered for exactly the dynamic I assume you're talking about. So try explaining that to a 10-year-old kid here who doesn't understand those global politics and why that could even be an issue. But so when it comes to China's role then in our domestic politics. So there's one example. I think that the Chinese organize their own rallies to show support for China relative to the Hong Kong protesters, and we're doing so here and I assume in other countries. They are accused of, and a lot of people believe there's significant evidence that they have online been trying to affect our own views on issues. Have you seen any of, in your reporting, any of the tangible evidence of the role that China is trying to play in our domestic politics?
Well, I mean, I think, and certainly in terms of affecting opinions, I mean, one interesting example is the fact that most of the Chinese language media in Canada is now owned by business people that are allied with Beijing, with the regime. So, you know, those newspapers and radio and TV stations tend not to do, produce anything sort of critical of the People's Republic. So I mean that in itself, I think, is affecting political opinions of Chinese-speaking people in Canada. They definitely seem to be trying to encourage. And this is gets into a controversial area, trying to encourage the development of politicians who are pro-China. There's a branch of the Communist Party called the United Front Work Department, which is involved heavily in this sort of influence campaigns in foreign countries, targeting partly the diaspora, but also sort of political elites in different countries, including Canada. There was a document of theirs that was leaked a few years ago to the Financial Times that talked about, specifically about how a number of Chinese Canadian politicians had been elected in the Toronto areas in the early 2000s, and saying, these are the kind of people that these United Front cadres should be working with and trying to sort of develop or bring over to our side, essentially. And there are certainly, provincially and federally, there are members of parliament and legislatures who definitely have been sort of pinpointed as people who are loyal, I guess.
Or have certainly spoken out publicly, pro Beijing.
Or their backgrounds suggest that they have a close connection with Beijing, yeah.
How about, have you seen evidence of China trying to sow discord on issues in Canada, just from try to pull people apart a little bit rather than have Canadians be cohesive on issues? Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, it's quite possible that kind of thing is happening. Is sort of similar to what the Russians did in the U.S. during the last election there. I'm not sure that is a big focus. I think they're more geared towards trying to change opinions, both amongst the population and amongst politicians to favor sort of the Chinese side in some of these sort of disputes and that kind of thing, rather than sort of creating turmoil by accentuating divisions in society.
So presumably this plays specifically in and around Toronto and 905. There are some ridings, I think, that are heavily Chinese in Markham and in Scarborough, maybe a little bit in Peel region as well, and then in Lower Mainland, in and around Vancouver. I think that those are probably the areas where there's the most significant factor there. And I think too that over time, parties, knowing that they need to nominate people that are likely to get elected, and knowing who the electors are going to be, have sought out candidates. And I suspect there's been an element of being less concerned about what those candidates' views may be about China, and more concerned about, is this person electable because they want to win a seat, has probably played into the hands of those that want to affect from the inside.
Yeah, exactly. I won't get into specifics or names or anything, but there is a riding in Toronto where one sort of, I think you could safely say, very pro-Beijing member decided not to run again, and there's some interesting reasons behind that, but the candidate who's nominated in that person's place also seems to be closely allied with the sort of pro-Beijing forces in the Toronto area. He told me that that's not true. That he's Canadian first and et cetera, et cetera. But certainly in terms of who has helped him in his campaign and that kind of thing, it sort of suggests a very pro-Beijing leanings. I spoke a year or so ago with a Conservative candidate in one of the Lower Mainland ridings in BC who said, because of that sort of change in the immigration patterns, you have to be very careful in terms of being critical of the Chinese government. So, right. And in terms of the parties, I think they're interested in candidates who are going to win those ridings and who can also raise a lot of money, I guess.
Speaks to the kind of questions maybe that need to be raised in an election of those candidates, and not in an accusatory way, but also to understand where their views may be, so that it doesn't compromise Canada's role or the views that it can take on a global stage.
Yes.
India, I want to talk about India too. So no shortage of complicated politics there, and I don't pretend to know it all by any stretch. But we have, strong voting blocs here, Sikhs in particular, and in certain regions, 905 around Toronto, and Lower Mainland again in BC. But the views of whether or not either certain politicians or certain groups are more aligned pro-India in the current Indian government, relative to, say, whether they're viewed to be too closely aligned or closely aligned with the Khalistanis, I get that wrong every time, I think plays a big role here, and I think you've spent some time on this issue too.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's quite a fascinating sort of dynamic, and the population of people of Indian background in Canada is something over 1 million, I think, and of those, about half are of Sikh background, and so we're talking about less than 1 million, but they have a sort of disproportionate impact on Canadian politics. I think the Sikh Canadians do. There's something like 17 Sikh MPs in Parliament, which is far greater than their percentage of the population, and of course four Sikh members of cabinet, which right. Prime Minister has often talked about. So I think what we have seen in the past is certainly parties, I think, particularly sort of reaching out to the Sikh community, because it seems to be the very politically active community, and seems to often vote sort of as a bloc for one party or the other. But that in itself has created tensions between Canada and India, because certainly the current Indian government views the Liberal government as being pro-Khalistani, as being supportive of those in Canada who support a Sikh homeland in India, which is they would call Khalistan.
Right.
And there's certain politicians in India who have been very critical of the Liberals over this, which again seems to be playing out on the ground here. And there is this suspicion on the part of certainly the Sikh community, I've heard this from various sources, that the Indian government is sort of interfering in this situation in Canada, and perhaps is allying itself with the Conservatives, who some feel are more pro the Narendra Modi government in India, right. and less pro Sikh separatism. I haven't seen any sort of direct evidence of the Indian government sort of interfering in that way, but it's an interesting idea. And certainly, Stephen Harper gave a speech recently in which he was very highly praised Modi, mm-hmm. criticized those who support the Khalistani movement. So sort of supported that idea of the Conservatives being more on that side of things.
My own recollection from speaking to people was the Modi support stemmed, though, from the economic reforms he brought first to Gujarat and then is trying to bring to broader India, and the message of cleaning up government, getting rid of the corruption that I think still exists, and people can argue whether he's really doing that or not. It was that kind of message I thought that conservatives were latching onto and using as an example of what can be done, especially the economic reforms in Gujarat. So as relates directly to how this can play, do you see that? Then that would you say that the Sikhs vote more as a bloc than the other Indians will, and does that have a direct effect then in some of those key ridings we just mentioned?
Yeah, I do think that it's really within the Indo-Canadian community, it is the Sikh vote that is influential. That they do tend to seems vote as a bloc more than other Indian Canadians. Interestingly, the World Sikh Organization, which is actually a Canadian organization that's quite influential, has sort of mapped out all the ridings where Sikhs have a significant influence, and I think they identified something like 20, 25 across the country, and 9 in which they say that Sikhs can decide the election in that riding, and they're saying, in a close election, the Sikhs could win it for one side or the other. That's obviously debatable and hard to prove one way or the other. But I think there is definitely some truth to that, and often these are swing ridings that have gone back and forth. So
sure,
in that sense, could be quite impactful.
Proves the influence, I think.
Exactly.
Okay. Middle East. We just get muddier and muddier and muddier as we go along. In terms of both understanding all the dynamics and how it might play here. So, well, let's focus a little bit on Palestine and Israel. I'm fascinated, as we've seen. Again, I think it's a more recent development, but maybe its roots go back far further than I'm aware. But I see in both Canada and the United States, there seems to be a bit of a fault line that has developed where conservatives are viewed as or are more pro-Israel, and liberals or Democrats seem to be more pro-Palestine. And I know both sides try to play the other as well, but that seems to be how it's broken down. Is that a more recent development, one, in your view? And two, let's then bring it back and how it might play into domestic politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is relatively recent in the sense that I think before Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, conservative governments also tended to in Canada, to follow sort of the kind of the consensus of the Western world, in terms of supporting a two-state solution, and sort of trying to take a balanced kind of approach vis-a-vis the Palestinians and Israelis. Harper very much, although it's interesting, the official stance of the government on the two-state solution and occupied territories and all that didn't really officially change. Harper did take a very pro-Israel approach, and certainly, often voices support for Netanyahu. They were, by all accounts, actually close friends, or as close as world leaders can be. I think Andrew Scheer has, to a certain extent, has continued that approach towards Israel and the Palestinians, and the liberals have continued that sort of more, arguably pro-Palestinian or at least sort of balanced approach. I'm not sure how will play here. I mean, a lot of Jewish Canadians tend not to be as conservative in their approach or as pro-Israel in their approach to that issue, I think, as some politicians maybe are. But then on the other hand, I think we have growing Muslim population in Canada, who I think obviously would be more receptive to an approach that's pro-Palestinian. So that could be a positive politically for the Liberals, I guess.
Certainly, there seems to be a big movement on campus among young people to be more. And again, I'm sure there's groups behind this that have been driving more of a pro-Palestine view that seemed. I mean, university and college campuses are always the hub of social activism, et cetera. So if they perceive that there's an underdog and somebody that needs to be supported, that tends to be where it grows from. But I find that interesting if you connect it to the last election in particular, where there were 1.2 million new voters, mostly people between 18 and 30 that had not voted before, and about half of those voted for Trudeau and for the Liberal government. So, I think you can start to draw a little bit of a line here between some of that activism that's more pro-Palestine, to young voters being active, to maybe the stance of the Liberal Party as it relates to a global viewpoint relative to Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could well be true. I mean, of course, those sort of campus movements sometimes are, a little bit extremist and perhaps don't necessarily represent, the sort of majority of people in that age group. But yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, on the other hand, I think, to the extent that sort of ordinary Canadians follow the politics in the Middle East, I mean, I think there is always a lot of sympathy for Israel, which, has the look and feel of a Western country, I guess. Right. So I wouldn't discount that as being sort of something that would sort of support the conservative viewpoint on it.
And I think it plays heavily in certain ridings in Montreal, certain ridings here, North Toronto, Midtown, that kind of thing, where heavy Jewish populations, and it. But you're right. It doesn't necessarily break down. I think it's helped the Conservatives, the approach that they've taken in ridings like Willowdale, Thornhill, in North Toronto. But at the same time, I live in a heavily Jewish riding in the middle of the city, and it's been Liberal for back 30 years practically. So it's not doesn't necessarily break down specifically on those lines. Let's spend a couple of minutes on the more recent activities and things that have happened in the campaign, and because I think that the response to it is interesting to look at and breaking down on different lines. And that's the blackface issue that the Prime Minister has been embroiled in for a week now. I'm sure everybody's aware, but there are three separate instances of be they gala events or things at parties as a kid. Prime Minister was in blackface or brownface, and we can talk about the use of the two different terms. It's become both an issue that he had to apologize for, but also an issue where on the global scale, I think that it's had an impact on the view of his own personal credibility, but also of Canada. I mean, if I look globally, the two things that we've probably made the most headlines for in the last 5 years have been Rob Ford and our mayor and his own issues and drug problems, and Trudeau and blackface, really. And neither of them reflect all that well on Canada. But how have you seen that reaction over the course of this week, and how does that global view of of Trudeau in particular impact back at home?
Yeah, well, no, it's interesting, and I would sort of say, in terms of your analysis of Canadian politicians who have a profile on the world stage, I would say with Trudeau, it kind of started before blackface. It was, I think he made a mark on the world stage like, relatively few Canadian prime ministers have. He was seen by Liberals as sort of embodying that sort of perspective. Yep. As a counterpoint to Donald Trump, and et cetera, et cetera.
Environmental leader, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And I think the blackface incident will definitely sort of tarnish that and takes away from that sort of reputation he had on the world stage. And I think, I think to the extent that some Canadians might have been sort of proud of that stature he had internationally, the fact that the blackface thing has largely sort of dismantled that, I think could have an impact on people, who might sort of want to vote for him because he's puts a good face forward for Canada on the world stage. Maybe that's not the case anymore. In terms of looking at these sort of ethnic blocks, I mean, it's a little less clear to me. I mean, it's interesting talking about the Sikh community and their influence. One of my sources who's extremely well plugged in to the political scene in the GTA said that in the Brampton, Mississauga area where a lot of Sikh Canadians live, the whole blackface thing, for whatever reason, has had virtually no impact. People don't in the Sikh community don't care. He maintains, and he argues that the Liberals are going to easily carry all those ridings again. That's not a scientific assessment, so who knows if that's true. But again, as you mentioned, the polls, subsequent to that story breaking, sort of don't indicate a huge movement.
Don't seem to have.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that even may be the case amongst ethnic groups.
I think that, and I raised some eyebrows, but I've drawn the analogy of Trudeau and Trump being two sides of the same coin. In some respect, both know and have been able to get away with a lot. In some cases, it's more like mistakes. In some cases, it's very deliberate, provocative behavior, but get away with a lot and not risk losing any of their support. So if I take the blackface incident, I think that it just reinforces people's existing beliefs. If you already thought that the Prime Minister was a bit of if you thought he was a lightweight, if you thought you didn't take him very seriously, this probably just fed into your own views. If you're already a Trudeau supporter and you believe that he's doing the right thing for the country and the right thing for the world, you're more likely to say, yeah, it's a dumb mistake, but he apologized for it, and you move on. Mm-hmm. And I think by and large, Canadians tend to, we're pretty forgiving in that regard, but I would say this whole incident just reinforced people's existing views. Similarly, Trump is not going to lose anybody that still supports Trump is not going anywhere, and he knows it, right? He's infamously said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue in broad daylight and he wouldn't lose a supporter. And there's a little bit too much truth to that, I think, than I'd like to see. But I'm fascinated by whether or not if you're being made fun of on a global stage by comedians, what have you, cartoonists and papers around the world, if I'm from Croatia and he's being made fun of in Croatia, does it affect then my family who now view that this guy is a bit of a something, they don't like him anymore? Does that affect how I might vote here? And have you seen those ties back to how Canadians react?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I have not seen much sort of evidence of that. I mean, it may come, but I mean, I don't see that as being a big factor. I mean, I think, amongst immigrant communities, I suspect that other factors are more important. For instance, actual immigration policies of the parties,
right,
and things like social conservative issues, and the stances the parties take on that, I suspect are going to be more important than how Trudeau is viewed on the world stage. Except, again, like I said, from that sort of general point of view of, if you're voting for the guy who's going to make Canada look good internationally, is he necessarily the one? But
right.
But in terms of, sort of poor reception of Trudeau in other countries and that sort of impacting the diaspora of those countries back here, I don't see that happening.
Their specific views on immigration policies are going to play a factor in this election. I think it's a topic for another entire show. It plays particularly differently in Quebec than it does elsewhere. We've got one candidate, Maxime Bernier, who's taken a very strong, essentially anti-immigration stance, at least in the sense of both limiting how many and how they can arrive in Canada. Scheer has played upon this concern that Canadians have about our porous borders, maybe, but otherwise conservatives and liberals have by and large had a very similar immigration policy for years and years. But I'd like to spend time on that on another day. It's been great to tap into somebody who spends a lot of time looking at those global issues and ethnic groups and how that might impact here, and bringing certainly a set of knowledge that I don't have to the table. So I appreciate that, Tom, and thanks for joining us today on our show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's fun.
Great.